The engine sputtered its last breath, with a sigh that mirrored my own mounting despair. Dusk was bleeding into a bruised purple across the desolate countryside, and the narrow, winding road had offered nothing but the relentless company of skeletal trees for the past hour. My phone, predictably, displayed the grim reaper of connectivity, no signal. Stranded, utterly and completely stranded. A flicker of light in the distance, a tiny, improbable star in the encroaching darkness, sparked a fragile tendril of hope. It had to be a settlement, a house, anything. With renewed determination, I trudged onward, the gravel crunching under my shoes the only sound in the deepening silence. As I drew closer, the light resolved itself into the warm, inviting glow of windows. It emanated from a cluster of buildings huddled together, a village seemingly untouched by the relentless march of time. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and something else, something subtly sweet and unsettling. The village felt wrong. An unnatural stillness hung in the air, broken only by the whisper of a wind that seemed to carry secrets on its breath. The houses were small, their roofs sagging like tired eyelids, their windows dark and vacant. Paint peeled from the wooden frames like sunburnt skin, revealing the gray bones beneath. There was no laughter, no barking dogs, no sounds of life that one would expect from a human habitation. The villagers I encountered were few and far between, their movements slow and deliberate, their faces pale and gaunt. Their eyes were the most disturbing, hollow, dark pools that seemed to look right through me, devoid of any discernible emotion. They wore simple, old-fashioned clothes, their expressions fixed in a strange, almost vacant serenity. Their conversations, snippets I overheard as they passed, were stilted and formal, filled with archaic phrases that felt jarringly out of place. Time, in this forgotten corner of the world, seemed to have stagnated. Drawn by the most welcoming light, I found myself standing before a small building with a weathered sign creaking gently in the breeze. The Willow's Rest. It looked like a tea shop or a small inn. Stepping inside, I was enveloped by a heavy, musty air, thick with the scent of dried herbs and something vaguely metallic. The interior was dimly lit by flickering oil lamps, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. A handful of villagers sat at wooden tables, their movements as languid as those outside. They turned their hollow gazes towards me as I entered, their silence more unnerving than any hostile greeting. Behind a long, scarred counter stood an old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her dark eyes holding that same unsettling emptiness. She offered a slow, almost hesitant smile. "Welcome, traveler." Her voice was a low, rustling murmur, like dry leaves skittering across stone. "You are far from the main road." I explained my predicament. The broken-down car, the failing light. She listened with an unnerving stillness, her gaze never wavering. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "The night is unkind to strangers here. You would do well to stay until morning." Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a prickle of unease. There was something in her tone, in the way the other villagers watched me, that set my teeth on edge. She offered me tea, a dark, bitter brew that left a strange, tingling sensation on my tongue. As I sipped it, a young man with sunken cheeks and eyes that seemed to hold ancient sorrow approached my table. He spoke in a low whisper, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the lamps. "Leave before nightfall, stranger. This place is not what it seems." Before I could question him, the old woman behind the counter called his name sharply, her hollow eyes fixing him with a look that seemed to extinguish any flicker of defiance in his gaze. He retreated silently, melting back into the shadows. The air in the tea shop grew heavier, the silence more oppressive. The other villagers resumed their quiet vigil, their gazes occasionally flicking towards me with a mixture of pity and something akin to fear. As darkness fully descended upon the village, an eerie transformation began. The whispering wind outside intensified, seeming to moan through the cracks in the walls. The shadows within the tea shop deepened, taking on indistinct, unsettling shapes. The faces of the villagers seemed to grow paler, their hollow eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight like dark, bottomless pools. A low, rhythmic chanting began somewhere outside, a sound that vibrated through the very floorboards. It was ancient and guttural, sending a shiver down my spine. The villagers inside seemed to become more agitated, their silent stillness replaced by a subtle tremor. The old woman behind the counter looked at me, her hollow eyes now filled with a profound sadness. "The veil thins tonight," she murmured, her voice barely a breath. The memories they returned. Then, the first apparition appeared, A translucent figure, shimmering like heat haze, drifted through the wall. It was the figure of a young woman, her face contorted in silent grief, her hands outstretched as if reaching for something lost. She made no sound, but her sorrow was palpable, a heavy weight in the already oppressive atmosphere. More figures followed, their forms flickering in the dim light. Men in old-fashioned attire, children with vacant stares, their silent anguish filling the room. The villagers around me seemed oblivious, their hollow eyes fixed on some unseen spectacle. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced through my initial unease. This was no ordinary village. This was something else, something spectral. The young man who had warned me earlier now stood beside my table, his translucent form barely visible. "We are the lost," he whispered, his voice a mournful sigh. "Trapped between worlds. This village, it died long ago." He gestured towards the spectral figures. "They are the echoes of our last moments. The rituals, they try to bind us here." The chanting outside grew louder, more insistent. The spectral figures within the tea shop began to move with greater urgency, their silent cries growing more intense. I could now discern details. The bloodstains on a spectral man's coat, the vacant terror in a child's eyes. The old woman behind the counter turned to me, her face now a mask of profound despair. "You should not have come here, traveler. This place, it clings to those who linger." Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. The oil lamps flickered violently, casting wild, distorted shadows. The chanting outside reached a fever pitch, and the spectral figures in the room seemed to writhe in silent agony. A horrifying realization dawned upon me. The villagers I had seen earlier, the ones who seemed so strangely vacant, they were no different from these spectral figures. They were the ghosts of the village, caught in some endless, terrifying loop. The young man beside me reached out a translucent hand. "Join us," he whispered, his hollow eyes filled with a strange mixture of sorrow and resignation. "Become one of us. The night, it never truly ends here." Panic seized me. I stumbled back from the table, desperate to escape this spectral prison. The door, which had seemed so welcoming just hours ago, now loomed like a gaping maw. As I reached for the handle, the old woman's voice echoed in my ears, laced with chilling finality. "You are already part of it, traveler. You just don't know it yet." I wrenched the door open and plunged out into the night, the chilling wind whipping around me. The spectral figures from the tea shop seemed to spill out behind me, their silent cries pursuing me into the darkness. I ran blindly through the deserted streets, the broken houses looming like skeletal sentinels on either side. The chanting echoed in my ears, growing louder with every frantic step. The fog, which had been a mere mist earlier, now swirled around me, thick and suffocating, filled with the icy touch of unseen hands. I could feel them behind me, the silent, sorrowful presence of the dead. Their hollow eyes burned into my back. Their despair clung to me like a shroud. Then I saw it, a faint light in the distance, a pale, ethereal glow emanating from the edge of the village. Hope, fragile but insistent, flickered within me. It had to be the way out. I stumbled towards the light, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my chest. The spectral figures followed, their forms shimmering in the fog. The chanting intensified, reaching a deafening crescendo. As I reached the edge of the village, the light resolved itself into a swirling vortex of pale mist. It pulsed with an otherworldly energy, beckoning me forward. With a final surge of adrenaline, I plunged into the swirling mist. For a moment, there was only a blinding white light, a sensation of being pulled and stretched, and then nothing. I awoke to the chirping of birds and the warmth of the morning sun on my face. I was lying on the side of a familiar road, the asphalt warm beneath my cheek. My car, miraculously, was parked a few feet away, seemingly untouched. Relief so profound it almost buckled my knees washed over me. It had been a nightmare, a terrible, vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion and the isolation of the long drive. I got to my feet, my body aching, my mind still reeling from the terrifying images. I looked back in the direction I had walked, expecting to see the cluster of houses, the welcoming glow of the Willow's Rest. There was nothing, only the desolate expanse of the countryside, stretching out under the clear morning sky. No village, no tea shop, nothing but the skeletal trees and the winding road. Shaking my head, trying to dismiss the lingering unease, I got into my car and started the engine. It turned over smoothly, as if nothing had happened. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. For a fleeting moment, through the dust kicked up by my tires, I thought I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. An old woman. Her face a road map of wrinkles. Her dark eyes hollow and filled with an infinite sadness. She was watching me, her gaze unwavering. And then, she was gone. I pressed down on the accelerator, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and that empty stretch of road. But the memory of those hollow eyes, the chilling whisper of the wind, the spectral figures in the dim light of the Willow's rest, they remained, etched into the deepest corners of my mind. Days turned into weeks. I tried to forget, to rationalize it as a dream, the trick of the tired mind. But the unsettling feeling persisted, a cold knot of dread in the pit of my stomach. One evening, while looking through some old photographs, I found one that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of my grandparents, taken many years ago, during a trip to the countryside. In the background, barely visible, was a small, dilapidated building. The sign above the door was faded but still discernible. The Willow's Rest, and standing in the doorway, her face partially obscured by shadow, was a woman with a familiar silhouette. An old woman with a distinctive set of wrinkles around her eyes. My breath hitched. I zoomed in on the photograph, my hands trembling. The face was blurry, indistinct, but there was something in the set of her jaw, the way she held her head. It was undeniably the old woman from the tea shop. A horrifying realization washed over me, colder and more suffocating than the fog in that spectral village. The village hadn't vanished. It had always been there, a place caught outside of time, a haven for the lost. And I had been there before. The memories flickered back, fragmented and distorted. A childhood trip with my grandparents, a wrong turn on a country road, a brief stop at a quaint little tea shop, the tea I had drunk that night, the bitter brew that had left a strange tingling sensation on my tongue. It wasn't just tea. It was something else, something that had allowed me to see them, to briefly step into their spectral realm. And the old woman's final words echoed in my mind. "You are already part of it, traveler. You just don't know it yet." I looked at my reflection in the window, my own eyes staring back, perhaps a little wider, a little darker than before. A chilling thought crept into my consciousness. Had something of that place, of those lost souls, remained with me? Was I now carrying a piece of that cursed village within me? The chirping of birds outside suddenly sounded less cheerful, more like the rustling whispers of dry leaves. The warmth of the sun on my skin felt strangely cold. I was no longer sure if I had truly escaped. Perhaps a part of me was still there, trapped in the timeless twilight of that forgotten village, forever a silent guest at the Willow's Rest. The miracle I had hoped for hadn't been an escape. It had been the horrifying realization that the curse wasn't confined to the village. It could follow you home. It could become a part of you. And the night, I now knew with chilling certainty, never truly ends. The photograph, that innocuous relic of a bygone summer, became a morbid anchor, tethering me to the chilling reality of my experience. The blurry image of the old woman in the doorway of the Willow's Rest haunted my waking hours and seeped into my dreams, her hollow eyes seeming to follow me through the veil of sleep. I tried to find the place again, retracing my route, poring over maps, but the countryside remained stubbornly ordinary. The winding roads led only to other winding roads, bordered by familiar fields and unremarkable villages. There was no trace of the desolate landscape, the sagging houses, the oppressive stillness of the village that had held me captive in its spectral embrace. It was as if the place existed in a fold of reality, accessible only under certain unknowable conditions. The unsettling feeling within me intensified. I found myself increasingly drawn to old, forgotten places, feeling a strange resonance with the quiet melancholy that clung to them. Shadows seemed to lengthen and deepen around me, and the whisper of the wind often sounded like the mournful sighs of the lost souls I had encountered. Sleep offered no respite. My dreams were filled with translucent figures drifting through dimly lit rooms, their silent anguish a constant, suffocating presence. The rhythmic chanting echoed in the darkness behind my eyelids, a primal sound that vibrated with an ancient sorrow. I started to notice subtle changes in myself. A certain languor crept into my movements. A quiet stillness settled over my features. My reflection in the mirror sometimes seemed paler, the depths of my eyes holding a hint of that same unsettling emptiness I had seen in the villagers. One evening, I found myself drawn to an antique shop in a forgotten corner of the city. Amidst the dusty relics of the past, my gaze fell upon a small, intricately carved wooden box. Its surface was adorned with strange, unfamiliar symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint inner energy. As I touched the box, a jolt, like a static shock, ran through my hand. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and the air around me seemed to shimmer. For a fleeting moment, the familiar sounds of the city faded, replaced by the faint, rhythmic chanting I had heard in the village. The old shopkeeper, a wizened man with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of stories, watched me with a knowing gaze. "That belonged to a traveler," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Lost his way in the countryside, years ago. Never quite the same after he came back." He didn't elaborate, but his words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I bought the box, an inexplicable compulsion driving me. Back in my apartment, I placed the wooden box on my bedside table. As darkness fell, a faint, ethereal glow emanated from within it, casting strange shadows on the walls. The chanting in my dreams grew louder, more insistent, and the spectral figures seemed closer, their silent cries almost audible. One night, I dreamt I was back in the Willow's Rest. The tea shop was filled with translucent figures, their faces pale and gaunt in the flickering lamplight. The old woman stood behind the counter, her hollow eyes fixed on me with a look of profound resignation. "You cannot leave," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "Once you have seen us, a part of you stays here." The veil thins, and you are drawn back. The young man who had warned me approached, his spectral form shimmering in the dim light. "Welcome home," he said, his voice a mournful sigh. I tried to speak, to protest, but no sound came out. I looked down at my hands, and they seemed less solid, more translucent, as if the edges of my being were beginning to blur. Terror, cold and absolute, gripped me. Was I becoming like them? Was the spectral village seeping into my reality, transforming me into one of its lost souls? I woke up with a gasp, my heart pounding, the lingering chill of the dream clinging to me like a shroud. The wooden box on my bedside table pulsed with a faint, eerie light, driven by a desperate need to understand, to break free from this encroaching spectral influence. I began to research the history of the region where I had broken down. Old maps, local folklore, forgotten legends. I devoured them all, searching for any mention of a village lost to time, any tales of strange occurrences or unexplained disappearances. I found nothing concrete, only whispers and rumors of a cursed settlement, a place where tragedy had struck long ago, leaving behind a lingering sorrow. Some spoke of a fire, others of a sickness that had swept through the village, claiming every soul. The details were vague, shrouded in the mists of time and fear. Then, I stumbled upon an old journal in a local historical society. It belonged to a traveler from the late 19th century who had written of finding a peculiar village hidden deep in the countryside. His descriptions chilled me to the bone. He spoke of silent villagers with hollow eyes, of an unnatural stillness in the air, of a tea shop called the Willow's Rest. He wrote of feeling an overwhelming sense of sorrow, and a strange pull to remain in the village. The journal ended abruptly, the last entry a scrawled, desperate plea. "I can feel them! They are calling me. I cannot leave." A cold dread washed over me. The traveler had never left. He had become one of them. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The curse of the village wasn't just about being trapped within its boundaries. It was about being absorbed into its spectral existence, becoming another silent, sorrowful inhabitant of its timeless twilight. I looked at my reflection again, and this time, the change was undeniable. My skin had a pallid, almost translucent quality. The depths of my eyes held a profound weariness, an echo of the ancient sorrow I had witnessed. I could almost see the faint outline of the room behind me through my own hand. Panic surged through me. I had to break free, before I faded completely, before I became just another ghost in that forgotten village. I remembered the wooden box. The shopkeeper's words echoed in my mind. Never quite the same after he came back. Perhaps the box held a key, a connection to the spectral realm, or perhaps a way to sever it. Clutching the box tightly, I drove back to the antique shop. The old shopkeeper was there, his knowing gaze meeting mine. "You understand now," he said, his voice soft but grave. I nodded, my throat tight with fear. "The box? What is it?" He hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "It belonged to one of them, a villager who tried to escape. It holds a piece of their world, their sorrow. It can draw them to you, or, if used correctly, it can push them away." "How?" I pleaded. "It is tied to their memories, their pain," he explained. "You must confront that pain, acknowledge their loss, and somehow offer them peace." His words were cryptic, but I understood the essence. The curse wasn't a malevolent force. It was a lingering sorrow, a collective grief that had bound the spirits to the village. To break free, I had to somehow alleviate that sorrow. That night, I held the wooden box in my hands as I slept. My dreams were more vivid than ever. I was in the spectral village, surrounded by the translucent figures. They reached out to me, their silent cries filled with an unbearable longing. I closed my eyes and focused on the overwhelming sorrow that permeated the air. I tried to imagine their lives, their losses, the tragedy that had befallen them. I whispered words of comfort, of understanding, of peace. It felt futile, a whisper against a storm of ancient grief, but I persisted, pouring all my empathy, all my regret for their suffering, into the silent communion. As dawn approached, the ethereal glow of the wooden box intensified. The spectral figures in my dream began to fade, their sorrowful expressions softening, replaced by a look of acceptance. I woke up feeling strangely drained, but also lighter. The pallor of my skin seemed to have lessened. The emptiness in my eyes diminished. I opened the wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was intricately engraved with a willow tree. An image flashed through my mind, the weathered sign of the tea shop, the Willow's Rest. I knew what I had to do. I drove back to the countryside, not following the roads I had taken before, but guided by an inner sense, a faint pull in my chest. After hours of driving, I found myself on a narrow, overgrown track, barely discernible from the surrounding fields. Following the track, I came to a clearing, and there it was, the village. It looked exactly as I remembered it. The sagging houses, the peeling paint, the unnatural stillness in the air. But this time, there was a subtle difference. The shadows seemed less oppressive, the air less heavy. I walked through the deserted streets, the silence broken only by the gentle whisper of the wind. The spectral figures were there, their forms still translucent, but their expressions were no longer filled with anguish. There was a quiet serenity about them, a sense of acceptance. I found the Willow's Rest. The weathered sign creaked gently in the breeze. Stepping inside, the air was still musty, but the oppressive weight was gone. The spectral villagers sat at the tables, their hollow eyes now holding a flicker of something akin to peace. The old woman stood behind the counter. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a faint smile touch her lips. "You have brought them peace," she murmured, her voice no longer a rustling whisper, but a soft, gentle sigh. The young man approached me, his translucent form almost solid. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with a quiet gratitude. "We can finally rest." I opened the silver locket. Inside were two tiny, faded photographs. A young woman and a young man, their faces filled with a hopeful joy. They looked like the spectral figures I had seen. I understood then. The tragedy that had befallen the village had been a love story cut short. Their lingering sorrow was the echo of their lost happiness. I placed the locket on the counter. A soft, ethereal glow emanated from it, spreading through the tea shop. The spectral figures around me began to fade, their forms dissolving into the soft light. The old woman and the young man smiled at me one last time before they too vanished. The village remained, silent and still, but the oppressive atmosphere was gone. It felt like a place that had finally found peace. As I walked away, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fields. I looked back at the village, and for a moment, I thought I saw the faint glow of lights in the windows of the Willow's Rest, a final farewell. I drove away, the heavy weight that had been pressing down on me finally lifted. The curse of the village was broken, not by escape, but by understanding and compassion. The silver locket remained with me, a tangible reminder of the spectral village and the peace I had helped to bring. And though I would never forget the terror of that night, it was now intertwined with a profound sense of closure. The lost souls of the village were finally at rest, and in helping them find peace, I had, in a way, found my own. The miracle wasn't just their release. It was the unexpected capacity for empathy to reach across the veil of life and death, to heal wounds that time itself could not. And I knew, with a quiet certainty, that even in the darkest corners of the world, the light of compassion could still find a way to shine.